Adventures in Thair, Wakefeld Island, by Jace Masters. The shining silver tray trilled with its many contents as Lance carried the usual morning offerings through the vast empty hallways of his master's mansion. The air was laden with the smell of freshly ground coffee mixed with the scents of the master's usual breakfast delights. Blueberry scones, sausages, toast darkened to a mahogany brown, and 2 eggs sunny side up. Lance regretted only one thing in their lifetime, the fact that their construction would never allow him to experience the smell or taste of anything. Their metal and ancient alloy composite body just lacked the capacity of such mortal pleasures. Beyond that slight hindrance, though, Lance had never wanted anything more in their life than to serve their young master, and this day was no different. Making their way through the vast cathedral-like hallways of the mansion were some of Lance's favorite times of day. They always adored how the light played with the stained glass windows, shining a plethora of vibrant colors down through the many depictions of the young master's many exploits, casting sheaths of light that painted their own form in many reflective hues. As Lance passed through the final framework, basking them in a deep crimson, they knew the end of the hall was near, and that beyond the door their master would sit waiting at their desk, ready for his morning meal. "Good morning, Master Jonas," Lance gave his usual morning greeting. "I hope you are well rested and ready for another day of study and development." The figure sitting with his back to the desk did not respond. The young master must once again be entrenched in his research, Lance concluded. They made their way across the large study with their normal casual pace, admiring as they always did the vast library that made up most of the walls of the room. Row upon row of tomes and scrolls stacked into neatly organized columns the width and breadth of the room rose up onto the ceiling, leaving only one wall devoid of their litany of knowledge entrusted to paper or vellum. The wall the young master now faced in his revolving chair, the overlook as he liked to call it, consisted of nothing more than a large glass-paned frame overlooking the sky and the few remaining feet of ground beyond. Currently a scant few clouds drifted by sheepishly in the morning sky, their position indicating rain would most likely be on the way for the people on the ground below. Lance slid the silver tray onto the young master's large central desk, taking care not to move or knock anything else within the space. The master hated when that happened. As they released their grip on the tray, it rested for a moment before sliding back towards them ever so slightly. As Lance held out their hand to stop the tray, they noticed more things in the room were slightly out of place. The many scrolls on the western wall seemed disjointed, and some of the books had moved forward in their allotted spaces. "Young Master Jonas?" Lance spoke tentatively. The master did not like to be disturbed much. "It appears the island is off balance. Would you like me to inspect the central chamber to adjust the device?" There was no answer, no movement. The high-backed chair remained implacable and stoically aimed towards the outlook window. Lance secured the tray behind a heavy tome and moved over to the chair. "Young Master Jonas?" Moving in and grasping the back of the chair, Lance swiveled his master's seat around, revealing the man sitting in it. An old man with only a full, long, and white beard for hair stared through him with hollow, glazed-over eyes. Dressed in his attire from the night before, his honey-yellow scarf and lapis-blue robes remained impeccable. The usual stern look on the young master's face was gone, replaced by a peacefulness in his empty gaze that accentuated his slender and somewhat frail visage. Most of the color of his face was drained, save for the darker tones of the large scar leading from the bridge of his nose across his cheek and down to his neck, the last remnant of a battle now only remembered by the stained glass hallways of the mansion. It took Lance some time to process what had occurred. They stood silently for some time, feeling the world list ever more around them, slowly but steadily. A sudden crash of metal upon the floor shook Lance out of his stupor. Just behind him, the tome had proven not to have been enough, and the tray had fallen onto the floor despite its objections, spilling its contents over the floor below. Nearly immediately after, the thud, thud, thud of a number of books on the far wall followed, tumbling down and sliding as far as the bare wooden floor would allow. Unable to directly follow the command of the young master now that they were indisposed, Lance resolved to deal with the clear issue at hand and cleared up the mess of the breakfast foods that he had made before the master would become cross with him. Then, tray in hand, they made their apologies and moved back toward the doorway to the south. The way back proved more difficult as a number of tomes and scrolls had slid or rolled their way into his path. More than a few times Lance had to avoid stepping on the young master's valuable books. This would take some time to clean up and reorganize, they lamented to themselves. The island's listing was troublesome, but not catastrophic. Lance knew he simply had to go to the central chamber and realign the sphere powering the levitation device. In the past, the island had begun to list a number of times, usually when the master had been away for some time, and a minor adjustment generally did the trick reasonably quickly. The amount of listing this time, however, was proving to be more than it had been in the past. Before, the number of degrees never exceeded the single digits, but for this amount of shifting to have already happened, it would have to be over that already. Shifting his priorities, Lance decided to abandon his tray filled with the remnants of the young master's unfortunate would-be breakfast on a nearby windowsill, as speed seemed to be of greater concern. Deep below the mansion, at the center of the floating island, hummed an amorphous blob of blue crackling energy, a vast repository of arcane power established long ago by Jonas Wakefeld's ancestors. Each successive member in the Wakefeld line had maintained, empowered, and improved the orb and its surrounding systems to the best of their ability to ensure that the floating island would maintain its altitude and integrity. It had become the family's duty and pleasure to have this refuge, their own place in the world, safe from all but the most intrusive predators. As Lance opened the door leading into the central chamber, with some difficulty as the listing had grown to such an extent that they were now supporting themselves on the floor with one foot and on the lower wall with the other. The path ahead was clear. Luckily, everything in the area was bolted down or locked behind secure cabinets after an unfortunate incident some generations before had led to one of the Wakefeld children to be knocked into the path of the sphere, disintegrating them. Lance remembered the incident, but was no longer able to recall the name of the child or indeed even its features. Subordinate information unnecessary to the task at hand and to their overall function, they concluded. Lance estimated the listing to have increased to around 25% at this point, likely leaving most of the mansion upstairs in a semi-ruined state. If the current rate of turnover continued, Lance calculated that the contents of the islands would be lost over the edge in another hour at most. A most unfortunate consequence that they would like to prevent if at all possible. Unfortunately, the controls of the sphere's feeds and buffers were located some 30 feet away, halfway around the circular room. The inclination further exacerbated the situation, turning a rather simple walk into a climbing and clambering exercise suitable to adventurers, not a simple servant like themselves. Nevertheless, seeing no reasonable alternative that would lead to success, Lance set out beyond the doorway and reached out toward the railing in front of them. Bless the Wakefelds for installing these after the disintegration incident. Moving step by step, grasping onto the railing as they slowly made their way, Lance proceeded along the walkway slowly but steadily. They noted a significant increase in the pitch of the hum produced by the orb. By the time they managed to reach the overall control element on the other side of the chamber, Lance was having trouble keeping an even footing on the floor and needed to stabilize themselves by bracing against the console holding the controls itself. Standing on what equated to the side of the panel suddenly seemed strangely funny to Lance, and as they reached out to the many levers and buttons inlaid in the panel before him in an attempt to corral the unbalanced machinery, they let out a sound that could only be interpreted as a giggle. Stopping for a moment in the realization of what had just occurred, Lance steadied themselves and continued their attempt. As their nimble fingers flew across the manifold implements to try to bring balance back to the now whirring ball of wildly undulating power behind them, they felt like a tactician coordinating a battle. Every action caused a reaction, every problem solved posed a new issue. Slowly but steadily, though, they managed to counteract the imbalance in the energies and righten the island. Not a moment too soon, Lance thought, as they flipped the final lever in resting position. Young Master Jonas and his forebears had prepared well for these potentialities. As Lance took in their now straightened-out surroundings, they felt somewhat at ease. Though the whirring of the island's power source still continued unabated, the potential catastrophe of the island topping over was averted. Content in their work, they moved away from the console and around the center towards the door on the other side once again to make their exit. As they set a foot in the doorway, however, the crackle of lightning sounded behind them. Lance turned to see the source of the sound. Their eyes had only a moment to register the scene before they were blinded by a bright flash of light. Lance shook involuntarily, knowing what the sight had meant. They would have to act fast, very fast. Cursing themselves for not staying near the console, Lance leaped back into the circular room blindly. The expected ground fall of their feet never came. A feeling of weightlessness overtook Lance as they felt themselves floating in midair, moving towards the center of the room. The disorientation wore off quickly as they realized what had happened and knew there was only one way out. They would have to destroy the core. It had been a lovely day thus far, nearly cloudless save for a few fluffy shapes lazily drifting by the familiar floating island up above. Terry had known nothing but the soothing presence all his life. Knowing that the old wizard hermit up there was powerful enough to keep an entire island mansion afloat meant they could keep an eye out over all of them as well. It looked to be hovering a bit lower today, so old man Wakefeld must have had some business to look in upon below. He went about his normal routine, blissfully unaware of the slowly shifting and listing landmass above him. It wasn't until some time later, when he heard shouts and screams coming from around the town, that Terry would look at the island once more. His brain had trouble processing what his eyes were seeing. The island was hovering at an inclination, a strange sight to be sure, but there were things falling off of it too, smaller objects, some larger and some moving. Terry's heart sank as he saw what looked like a cow tumble off the island's edge to the earth down below. A moment later, another loud scream rang out, and panic struck the entire village at once. Lance hung in midair, computing or unable to compute the next necessary step. They knew what needed to be done, but now that the moment was there, they were uncertain if they could do it. The console had been a dead end. The overload of energy from the core had rendered it a smoldering heap by the time they were able to close in. There was only one solution now, one way to prevent the island from burying itself in the town below. What would the young master do? The thought lingered with Lance for just a moment before they knew the answer. Bracing against the wall over the ruined console, they crouched and pushed themselves off, flinging towards the center of the room and the orb hovering and sparking there still. The sensation was unlike anything Lance had ever experienced before. Starting with their head, a sense of power and energy filled them, ever present, ever increasing. Soon they were engulfed, lost in the orb, lost in the immensity before them. As white hot overtook the blue glow from the orb, they had only one thought in their mind: coast. The townsfolk had been scrambling for some time after cows started raining from the sky above. Most had just abandoned their homes and fled out of town carrying what they could with them. Terry had remained behind with some other men in town to keep an eye out for opportunists or looters. They knew the dangers of staying behind, but the men, including Terry, had faith in old Wakefeld. The island had never fallen, never wavered, a staunch protector for their town. When the island started righting itself, Terry had felt a sense of relief. Order was returning. It had only been short-lived though, as not long after, the island just appeared to lose buoyancy and began speeding down to the town below, down to him. He knew there wasn't enough time to get clear, so as the other men ran in vain, he stood, looking up. Slowly but surely, the size of the island became more clear as it began to blot out the sun. This was it, the end, crushed by a falling magical island. At least it was a creative death. Terry closed his eyes and accepted his fate, surprisingly still and calm. The end never came, however, and when suddenly the light of the sun warmed his face once more, Terry opened his eyes to see that the island was gone. No trace of it remained above him. Relieved, he breathed in deep once again, cold spring air filling his lungs. A few short moments later, off in the distance, he heard a loud crash. As he ran towards the edge of town to see what had happened, all he could see was a wall of water heading towards the coast, roaring and roiling, foaming and tearing. As it made landfall, the mass swept away everything in its path. Fishing boats, the docks, the warehouses, all gone in an instant, swept up by the waters. The wave broke on the cliff face, still spilling over onto the land and sweeping through the countryside, coating it in a thick layer of water and debris. The water continued its path until halfway through town, wetting the ground and Terry's feet as he stood in awe at the power he had just witnessed. In the distance, on the western horizon, a new island had appeared just off the coast, a lone mansion atop it. In the days, weeks and months that followed, many would attempt to go to the island and explore. Some returned, some didn't. Most were swept up by strange currents surrounding the island and sent straight back to the coast. Over time the interest waned and Wakefeld Island became nothing more than another ruined peninsula, a story told to local children, a fantastical tale of a floating island belonging to a powerful wizard. Some of those that returned said they saw movement on the island on their approach, claiming that the wizard or his ghost still haunts the ruins. The island itself remains, occasionally attracting adventurers foolish enough to attempt to visit it and claim the treasures that are said to lie within. None that make it to the island return, however. If you have any questions or remarks, please feel free to leave them in the comments. Thank you for watching. If you enjoyed this story, please share it, and check out my other stories, and subscribe for more tales yet to be told.